Willkommen, bienvenue, and welcome back to Scrap Mechanic with Lyte. And today we're going to be doing a bit of scrap science. It's going to be focusing on the suspensions. This will not be covering the suspension glitch. I'll cover that in a future episode. Today we're just going to go over what suspension actually does, and some of its properties and some of its numerical values. So let's hop right in, and as you can see, right behind where I was, the weight of suspensions is 0. That's right. They don't weigh anything. And I know you don't want to trust this particular scale. It's got the bearing in the middle, so there could be some either friction or sleep level on the bearing that would make it like, oh, maybe they're just really light. No, I went on to my actual official weights and measures balance and put an entire basket full of these suspensions on one side and nothing on the other, and it did not tip at all. So they either weigh 0 or, let's see, 11 by 11. So 121 of them weigh less than one would. So essentially 0, if not exactly 0. Okay, so they weigh nothing, but what can they do? So the way springs work is that the force applied to them causes compression, and thus they can store energy as potential energy, and how much that is varies on the length of the spring and the quote-unquote spring constant. So you can have tighter or looser springs that can store more within the same length. And then you can calculate what that actual constant is by measuring how far a certain amount of weight can compress it. So here we are with weight number 1. Let's get rid of this block. Kaplunk. And it compresses it completely. And you can look at this and do the arithmetic yourself, or just believe me that that's 384 wood worth of metal, tile, and wood. That includes this platform right down here. So you've got 3 by 3 by 5 in the middle. You've got the crosses of 6, which is 24 more metal, and then you've got the 6 tile and 1 wood there to make it look pretty. That's total compression on the off-road suspension. 384 wood maxes out that suspension. And it moves it, if you look very closely, that's almost exactly 2 blocks. If you look very closely, the red kind of goes a little bit lower than the wood. So it's not quite 2 full blocks of compression. Okay, over here we've got the sports suspension. Pretty sure it's called sports suspension. So sports suspension and off-road suspension. And when they say lightweight, they kind of underplay how light it really is. Okay, so now we've got 3 by 3 by 5, 2 tile and wood, which is essentially another metal. So you've got 46 metal, maxes out the sports suspension, which goes down pretty much exactly 1 block. That's about as exact as you're going to get. 1 block worth of compression from 46 metal plus this base, which is 26. So that for full compression is 256 wood. Nice round programmer number. Over here, we're going to start getting into properties of springs in parallel and in series. This takes into account Hooke's law and might be slightly unintuitive for anyone who hasn't studied springs, like me. I hadn't studied springs in the physics classes that I've taken. Oddly enough, I don't know why we never covered Hooke's law, but we didn't. Or I completely 100% forgot, which is also possible. So you've got the same weight as over here, and we're going to drop it onto 2 springs. And if you're like, oh, it'll just push it halfway down. Well, that would be nice. But incorrect. Oh, it got rid of the wood, too. Wood. Okay, so, yeah. You have gotten very little compression from the same amount of weight pressing down on 2 springs. Very little compression. Because springs in parallel increase the spring constant. So essentially they add together. So we now have double the spring constant versus the load, and the amount that it compresses isn't linear. It's quadratic. So, yeah, when putting things in parallel, 2 springs, they compress less than just cutting it in half. It's really fun. So these, together, barely compress at all, with the same weight as this, which compresses 1 completely. But then you're thinking, okay, so you put them in series, it should do pretty much the same thing. 2 springs, 2 springs. Well, nope. In series, it causes their effective spring constant to decrease. So the amount that this weight can compress in series is the same as if there were only 1 spring. It compresses it completely with these 2 springs, just like it did for the 1. So 2 springs in parallel, hardly any compression. 2 springs in series, complete compression. Which leads to this experiment over here. We've got probably 10 springs in a row. Let's run up to the top. So, given the science I've shown thus far, when I drop this weight onto these 10 springs, what's going to happen? Lag. That's what's going to happen. When you've got all of these pushing against each other, it goes a little crazy until they're maxed out, and then everything evens out again. But yes, that same weight maxes out all of these springs. So it might make you think, well, then having a bunch of springs in a row just doesn't do you any good. They all get maxed out by just a little bit of weight. It all depends on what you want them to do. So on a car, you want these parallel suspensions because you want to support a lot of weight without a lot of compression. So you need quite a bit of weight to max out your suspension, so it'll keep you relatively bouncy and stable. If it maxes out all the time, you're going to have a bouncy ride like you got no suspension at all. But if you're trying to make a cannon, you've got 3 maxed out springs, all fed with the same weight. You can max out 3 springs with the same weight that you max out 1. But if we get rid of this middle block here, this big weight will be detached and you'll have 2 small weights, which will be pushed upwards by the springs. Now, if it took the same weight to feed all of the springs down, you might, I'm not saying you do, think that when I release this, they'll both go up the same height because it took the same weight to prime each side. Bonk. But it's not the case, because weight is not equal to energy. These springs store energy. They don't store weight. So the same amount of weight can add more energy to more springs than to fewer, with the same spring constant. There's a lot of ifs involved in this, but with the same weight, you can charge up all 10 of these springs, and if you suddenly made that weight smaller, pachoo, 10 times as much oomph as just 1 spring. Because the weight is applied over more distance. So the weight is applied here for just 1 block, but over here it's applied for 3. So the 3 blocks of compression here store 3 times the energy as you had over here. When you release it, it becomes kinetic energy, flinging it upwards, roughly 3 times as high as the other guy. So when making cannons, you do want them in parallel, because then you don't put as much strain on what you use to cock the crossbow with. So if you've seen that design where it has 6 of these springs in a row and it's got a little yellow arm that reaches out and pulls it back. Well, if you were worried about your controllers maxing out if you made the cannon too big, they won't. Because if you can pull back one spring with the cocking mechanism, you can pull back all the springs with that same cocking mechanism, and it won't max out. Ever. If you try to put them in parallel, that's a whole other story. But in series, you can pull all of them back with the same amount of force. It just takes more distance and more time, which the controllers really don't mind at all. So, last, but certainly not least, we have here the spring constant weights. Now, I don't know what units you want your spring constants in, but this is the amount of weight it takes to compress each of these springs by one block. Now, it's not the same. These two springs have different spring constants, as far as I can tell scientifically. This one has one metal more than this one. So if we come down here and we remove this block and we put it back, there was no shifting of weight or anything. The frames kind of went a little wonky because it had to figure out whether or not it could in fact stay upright, but it was fine. It didn't infringe upon the space of that block. And the same is true over here. We can get rid of this. It has to make sure that it's good. And if we put it back, there's still space to put it there. Whew. Having this many springs compressed in one's world does cause quite a bit of lag. Like, it tries to compute a lot of things to make these springs keep working. I don't know if there is a way to optimize them. I certainly hope there is, because they're fun things to work with, but leaving them in a tensed form causes serious problems. I'll eventually do some FPS testing to see whether it's worse to have springs half-cocked or having controllers that can't quite keep the bearings up to snuff. But that should be enough for just basic usage of suspensions. Like I said, the suspension glitch is out of the scope of this episode. I'll cover it in a future one where I look into why the physics let that happen. But that's enough for this episode. I will see you in the next episode of Scrap Mechanic with Lyte.